Good morning. This is Mr. Pillsbury here to talk with you about the rise of totalitarian rulers. One of my favorite chapters, not because these guys were evil, but because these guys are just really interesting. So our essential question, as I'm going to get right into it, I don't want to waste any time, is how can political control lead to nationalist movements? And if you know what a nationalist movement is, it's pride in your country. How do we get that pride back in these countries for these people that have been beaten down by World War I? And these three men, Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin, are going to be the guys to do it. So I've got this little PowerPoint to go along with my diagram. I'm going to be going over the answers for the diagram while you guys are filling them in. So hopefully this works for you. Let's just start with post-war social changes. So what are the things that took place after World War I that really changed society? And it starts with the women. You know, the women were getting the right to vote. They were they were flappers, so they were cutting their hair short, showing their arms in public, and they were drinking. And this was changing our society as we know it, because most women were not doing these things at the time. And so that was pushing the boundaries of what women were, able and capable to do in our society. There's also a lot of war novels. So typically people write books and plays and poems, 5 to 10 years after a war takes place, because you need time to settle, because it's still kind of taboo to speak about those things. And so those things were going on, as well as there were some new scientific theories going on regarding penicillin. We were solving some of the medical problems that we were struggling with at the time. We also had theory of relativity by Einstein. We also had Sigmund Freud and his ability to address some of our psychological issues that we were dealing with after World War I. And this was really important because a lot of people came back with shell shock, which, they had all sorts of issues because of that. So this is some of the things. You can always make this go slower if I go too fast. Because I'm going fast because I only have limited space on my hard drive, and I'm trying to make this about 10 minutes long. So as we go into the next thing, what's going on with Western democracies as they stumble? And most people start to question democracy because they thought it just wasn't working at this particular time, because many of these countries will start heading towards we're heading towards a depression, which really puts things on the table. But you can see all the things that are taking place in these countries. So why would communism be an alternative that they would consider? Britain's moving towards socialism. France has a lot of financial scandals and political divisions. The United States, we had the Red Scare, Communist Red Scare in 1919-1920, where we started regulating the amount of immigrants coming into our country. And then we had the Great Depression in 1929, and that's going to radically change the way people view things, and they start to lose faith in the democracy. So another thing that I mentioned here is France will build what's called the Maginot Line. You'll hear more about this as we get into World War II. It's a line that separates France from all the other countries, thinking that if they fortified their borders, that maybe people would that would keep other countries out of their country or keep people from coming in. So here's a great picture of it. This is a bunker, and it went underground, and they had railroads and all sorts of other things. Another thing to consider as we move forward here is going to be, let me move forward over there. I guess this is 4 and 5. So I already talked about the Red Scare, and then I've talked about the Great Depression. You guys can pause as you fill these things out, but I'm going to talk about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was sponsored by the United States, and this was basically trying to make people to outlaw war and to pursue disarmament. Now, obviously, we know this is not going to be a good thing, because Hitler is going to arm their nation, and we're heading towards World War II. And so what's going to happen is a reduction of armed forces is going to take place. Now, obviously, we're going to have a buildup as we head towards 1936, but this is kind of this was going along with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, as he wanted to create a League of Nations, and this was kind of part of his vision. And so this is not going to be something that's going to be long-lasting as we move forward. All right, I'm moving on to my next slide here. Let's go over here to totalitarianism. As far as what is it? Totalitarianism is a government in which a one-party dictatorship regulates every aspect of a citizen's life. So think of it as like a king, but worse. So you absolutely have no freedoms, and you do exactly what the government wants you to do. And so that's kind of a horrible situation that we're going to be in, as these three men will go about wreaking havoc in Europe. So what is fascism? Fascism, I always, this is always tough for people to understand. Like, how is fascism different than totalitarianism? How is that different than an autocrat? So let's just go through the couple things that make up what is a fascist government. So it's a tyrant rule with nationalist policies. And as you can see, these guys are all dressed the same. You have a ruler and a tyrant, right? And this word actually comes from Mussolini. Mussolini is the guy who actually he's the first fascist government. And they're not communist, but it's all about their policies which glorify the state. So they have uniforms and rallies. Hitler and Mussolini are probably the two most famous fascists. They have common dress and chants and symbols and all sorts of things. The one thing that I really think separates them is their oppressiveness. And they glorify war. They like violence. They destroy books and art, and they get rid of teachers and people who have political ideas and thoughts that can help the state. And so that's important to know. So that's what fascism is. They reject faith. They don't have a religion. The religion is the state. And they have aggressive foreign expansion and are very anti-democratic. So that's kind of telling you what they are, just so if you see one again, you know what it is. Okay, let's keep going. And let's go to my next slide. Okay, let's start with Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, he was, I come up with the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps kind of describe how he rose to power. So how can a man like this rise to power? And number one, he was persistent. So he was a World War I trench runner. So he ran the trenches and he ran notes back and forth to generals and commanders or colonels or whatever. And he loved it. It was his best time of his life as he saw people around him dying. And, he had a lot of pain and suffering around him within his own family, which you'll learn about as you learn about his life. And we watch a couple videos on this, but he was very persistent. He was very popular during his time as a leader. People loved him. He actually got sent to prison in 1933, and which is where he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, which is down here. He says, man has become great through struggle, which is, he's referring to World War I. Whatever goal he has reached is due to his originality plus his brutality. The third point is political and economic instability. Without the depression, the global depression of 1929, 1930, I don't know if he would have come to power because, again, he was in jail for trying to lead this new government. And some people didn't like him and they thought he was a threat. Other people did like him because he was giving them confidence back in their country. One of the ways he got all this done was through the use of propaganda. And so his propaganda was flags and speeches and his book. And, he blamed the Jews for World War I, which gave an external blame to what was going on in and around these people, which said, it's not me. I'm not the problem. They're the problem. They being successful in our communities is the problem. And so he was trying to build this future. And so he eventually started to create the Hitler Youth, which we'll learn more about that as we get near the end of the unit. So I'm going to go over here to, let's see if I can do this. Okay, so we're going to learn about the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, he was also a significant player in this, but he had his 5-year plan. His 5-year plan was that of doing whatever means possible to industrialize and push agriculturally what Russia needed to do to be a global competitor with the rest of these countries. And they called it a command economy in which the government makes all economic decisions. The workers were pushed, offered bonuses, but overall workers had very little to show for anything. They also did what's called collectivization, putting people on large farms. We learned about it with the last unit. They provide the seed, the tractors, the fertilizer, the modern methods, and they made these people work until they almost died. He controlled all businesses. He was viewed as a god. He was absolutely a communist, and he made all the economic decisions. And that's one of the reasons why these two, Hitler and Stalin, will come up with a non-aggression pact towards each other, because they were scared of one another. and they thought that they were each a threat. And so that didn't last very long, as one will go against the other. My last slide is dealing with Mussolini. And Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, is our first fascist. He had what was called his black shirts. And the black shirts were kind of like his SS, I guess, equivalent in Italy. He was the son of a socialist, blacksmith, and a teacher. He will eventually take control of the government and organize people into these squads of black shirts that, like I just mentioned. And they'll march on Rome. And eventually they'll take over the government. And he took total control in 1925. He named himself El Dulce, which is basically means the leader. And he brought the economy under state control, as well as the industry and the agriculture. And the glorious state was the most important thing. And he had large public work projects. He had roads and schools and bridges and train stations. I guess his most famed thing was that he made the trains run on time. That's got to be mentioned because that's always mentioned. And so this just gives you a basic idea of what we're dealing with. And so these are the three men that are going to lead us towards these totalitarian ruling in all these different countries. So hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was informative. And you guys can always email me or text me if you have any questions about anything. Okay, have a great day. Talk to you later.